Coffee with Moshe. This is the coffee, and I'm Moshe. We are IKI, Israeli Krav International, an organization that has existed for about 15 years, serving the global community with effective Krav Maga. I'd like to discuss today a little bit of the history of Krav Maga, not just IKI. So the history begins around 1880. The Jewish people have always been connected and attached to the land of Israel, and Jews have always lived here. But for a long time, the numbers were very few. Due to some socio-political changes in Eastern Europe, and particularly the Pale of Settlement, Russia, Ukraine, these areas, Jews began to come back in greater numbers around the 1880s. They founded the modern city of Petah Tikva and later on Tel Aviv. They were greeted with hostility by the local Arab population that was rather meager at the time, and conflicts began, and eventually Jews had to begin fighting back. Growing up in Israel, I was not familiar with the term Krav Maga. I never heard it. We heard of judo, we heard of Bruce Lee, kung fu and that sort of stuff, karate. Judo was popular in Israel, still is, but I never heard the term Krav Maga until many years later. What I do want to relate is that speaking to old-timers, when I started training in martial arts, I began to hear some stories. Because when you become known as a martial artist, suddenly everybody has their stories. And I have a friend named Shuki, and he would tell me stories. I remember actually his father came to visit. His father was an old man. He said, "Oh yeah, we learned kapap." Kapap was the early name for Krav Maga. There's no difference between the two. It's just historical. Like the New York Knicks were once the New York Knickerbockers. For some reason, they shortened the name. So kapap is actually abbreviations for Kuf Pei Pei, which means Krav Panim Panim. Panim is face. Krav is combat, so to speak. So kapap means Krav Panim El Panim, face to face or hand to hand, just means close combat. And that's what it was called for a long time. It was also called Haganah, defense. And then eventually some people started calling it Krav Maga. And at some point the term switched. Both terms were being used at the same time. And eventually a committee came and decided we're going to call it Krav Maga. And the word kapap became history as of the late 1950s. And no longer exists since then. It no longer exists as a real separate martial art. It evolved into Krav Maga, or the term changed. In any event, so these old guys would tell me, we remember the kapap. We didn't have weapons, and the Arabs were attacking us. The Arabs in those days often rode camels or donkeys, and they had sticks. So the Jews also had sticks. And they took a biblical phrase that says, with your stick, you should travel the land, so to speak. And they said, Kum hitalech ba'aretz, come up and take a walk in the land. And they said, b'makel uvitarmil, with your knapsack and with your stick. And this stick became the weapon of self-defense of kapap, the early Krav Maga. That the Israelis would always travel with a stick. And it was a walking stick for hiking, which is very popular in Israel. And the stick was used for self-defense against two hands against the knife, against another stick, and so forth. So the main element of self-defense at that time, which was known as kapap, Krav Panim El Panim, face-to-face Krav, combat, was the stick. But this old fellow, Shuki's father, also took off his jacket and showed me how a jacket could easily become a weapon. Why? Because they didn't have guns. They didn't have knives. They didn't have the things we have today. So they improvised. So his father took off his jacket and showed how he could quickly, even as an old man, he was trained, he could quickly take off his jacket and use it to throw over my head, the head of the opponent, temporarily blinding the opponent, pulling him in, doing a knee kick, doing elbow strikes and basic techniques. Also how you could wrap the jacket or the clothing around your arm and use that as self-defense. So these were, from my own personal experiences, hearing from people who lived at the time, the early forms of Krav Maga, which was known as kapap. The stick, the jacket, sweater, a belt, all these things were used for self-defense at that time. And gradually, things evolved, and as things evolved, the stick became less significant. Join me for another episode.